Court is now resumed. You may be seated.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Your Honor.
Hong, Sir. Now, Council, I meant to tell you this morning. I asked university to look for a desk-mounted lectern for you, if that was your wish.
There is a lecture.
Right, if that's your wish. So it's there and we can try it out at some point if you'd like.
Thank you, Your Honor. So you asked me to give you an estimate.
Yes.
I think I have about maybe 4 to 5 hours,
Mhm.
roughly. So I won't finish today.
Right.
But in the second half, there are maybe 2 natural break points. I know it's going to be a long day for Madam Reporter. So if we get around 4 o'clock, and that might be, and I reach one of these points, that might be a good time to break. And in the morning, I might have an hour and a half left to finish. So
Very good,
we have
thank you.
we have 2 days booked, so it's plenty of time.
Very good. And you're ready? Oh. So what you're handing up is a compendium to go with your cross-examination?
That's correct, Your Honor. So I suggest we mark it for identification purposes, and I believe we're at Exhibit H. Is that right?
That's correct.
Good afternoon, Mr. Hutchings.
Hello.
My name is Edmund Hong. I am counsel for Ontario. It is Mr. Hutchings, right? I didn't hear my friend use Doctor or Professor.
Yeah, no, Mr. is good.
Perfect.
Thank you.
At least my first question is right then. You are still sworn in from examination in chief.
Okay.
Okay. And I just want to confirm the materials you prepared for this case. So you have an expert report from January 31st, 22, and I believe that's Exhibit 8.
I have a report from that date. I don't remember the date, not the date, the
Exhibit
exhibit
number.
numbering order.
Fair enough. You also have a text errata that my friend handed up June 13th, 2022. Does that sound right?
That sounds right.
I believe that's Exhibit 9. You have a reply report dated October 31st, 22.
That's correct.
Okay, I believe that's Exhibit 10. And you have 2 reports of January of 2023. One called an opening report and attachments, and one called a reply report. Does that sound right?
Right, with Professor Stiglitz.
That's correct.
Yeah.
And those are Exhibits 3 and 4.
Okay.
And this morning, oh, sorry, 4 and 5. And this morning, your work papers were entered as Exhibit 1A.
Yes, that's my understanding.
Okay, and your slide deck, I believe, is now Exhibit 11, and with the attachment of 12.
That's right.
Okay. There is another document. I wasn't sure if it was spoken to before. Could put it on the screen.
Sure.
So this is errata updates to calculated values and tables dated June 21st, 2022. Do you recognize this document, sir?
I do.
And this was errata to your January 31st, 2022 report. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay, I just want to identify to make sure I know what materials you prepared. And aside from the materials we just spoke about and this errata, is there any other reports or materials you prepared for this case?
No.
Great, thank you. And now you have a binder in front of you of materials for today, and it's called Exhibit H. Thank you.
Sorry, Exhibit 8?
H.
Oh, H. Okay.
Don't worry about the exhibit numbers. I'm just doing that for the record.
Okay.
My apologies. I also put a calculator on your desk. I've alerted my counsel. You don't have to use it. I'm just saying it's there in case there's you choose to use it later on in the exam. There's nothing more scintillating than economic theories except math.
Okay.
Okay. So when I've looked at your January 22 report, your Appendix B, you've listed the documents you've cited for this case.
That's correct. Each report has
Each
an
report.
appendix
I'm
that
just
lists the
taking-
documents for that report. Yeah.
That's right. I didn't see the pleadings listed. Did you review the pleadings before you wrote your reports?
I don't believe so.
Okay.
Sir, but no. I don't know that I've seen the pleadings at all.
Sorry, you're not sure or you haven't?
I certainly didn't rely on them. I don't believe I saw them. I certainly didn't ask after them.
Okay, thank you. Now, in your different reports, you describe the division of work between you and Professor Stiglitz.
That's correct.
So we've compiled them into a single sheet to make this easier. I'm going to put that on the screen for you. It's also at tab 1 of the binder.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
I'm allowed to open this now?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Yeah, it's not a secret.
Well, I thought it was like an exam. You were going to come up and like cut the ribbon. And
Yeah,
then I
you tear
could,
the tab now.
Get started or something.
You have 6 minutes. I'm not going to read them out, but I mean, that's the descriptions you gave for how you divide the work between Professor Stiglitz and yourself. Is that fair?
Yes, that looks right. I believe that's all the times we address the division of labor, but these look accurate.
Okay.
Sorry, this isn't the division of labor. This is when the division of labor was addressed. Is that what you're saying?
These are excerpts from his reports where they talk about which person did which roles, I guess, as more general.
Okay. Thank you.
So I take it you were responsible for doing the calculations and the charts and the tables in your reports?
Yes. I say for the reports, well, my hesitancy there was in the reports I did myself, not just the ones you have the excerpts of on the screen. I did everything, obviously, if I was the solo author. This division of labor only applies to exhibits 3 and 4, I guess.
Yeah, yes, thanks for that clarification.
Okay, sorry.
And in terms of the joint reports and your solo reports, you were the one who looked at all the various data sources and you were the one extracting what you thought was relevant.
Yes, that's right.
Okay. And during your testimony last week, when answering some questions from my friend, you used phrases like we calculated, we found, we created this table. When you use the pronoun we, did that mean you and maybe some people at Brattle group that assisted you?
Yes. I think also in all the reports is a statement that I worked with some assistants at Brattle. So I'm saying the we in terms of how we did the process, but ultimately, as between me and Professor Stiglitz, I did the calculations and signed off on everything and did the math at the end. Yeah,
That's right. So you had a competent team of professionals at Brattle helping you in your task.
yes,
Okay. And they helped you prepare the charts and tables.
yes.
Okay, great. Right. I assume Mr. Stiglitz wasn't spending his New Year's Eve with a calculator running these charts, so that clarifies that.
We can't rule it out, but I don't think that's how either of us spent our New Year's Eve.
Fair enough. But in terms of the Brattle team, you supervised all that work, I
Yes.
presume.
That's correct.
Thank you. Oh, and you can answer any questions about their work.
Yes,
Okay. And you were, I believe you were sitting in the courtroom for the testimony of Professor Stiglitz,
yes,
and you heard him characterize the concepts in your joint reports on economic rents, joint venture theory, 84% sharing model, the 60-40 bring forward rate, and income gap approach. You listened to his evidence on those concepts?
yeah, I listened to all of his evidence. I guess I would maybe describe the headings in that way. Like, I don't know that we have an 84% sharing model, but yeah, I was here for his description of all of the evidence. Yes.
Okay. And I know this morning you spoke to the calculations that flow from those concepts.
That's correct. Yeah.
Okay. Now for my next question, I'm not trying to get you in trouble. Just want to ask you, are you in agreement with how Professor Stiglitz characterized the concepts in your joint reports?
Yes.
Okay. And you agree with his explanation on how the two of you applied those concepts to this case?
Yes.
Okay. I mean, if there's anything he was completely wrong about, I guess now is your chance.
No.
There. Okay, just want to make sure we're on the same page.
Of course.
Now,
I may use different words to describe the same thing, but I didn't commit to memory what he said, but everything he said, I agree with,
thank you very much.
if that's helpful.
Yes, it is.
Okay.
I saw from your CV that a lot of your work is in respect of litigation support. You support a lot of lawsuits.
Yeah, I would say I, do the number crunching generally for lawsuits. Yeah.
Right, and you prepare reports.
Yep.
Similar to your work in this case.
Yes.
Okay. I also saw in your qualifications section that you were once a research assistant with the Atlantic Forestry Center branch of the Canadian Forest Service. Is that right?
That's right.
I'm assuming that wasn't a very long stint.
That's correct.
How long was it?
A few months.
Okay.
It was affiliated with the local university in Newfoundland. So I worked there for a little bit.
So aside from that short stint as a research assistant, you have never otherwise worked as an employee for Ontario or Canada?
That's correct. Never been an employee for Ontario or Canada. That's right.
And you haven't been otherwise an employee for any government?
An employee, no.
That's right.
I've been retained to do work for government agencies, but I've never, had an employee ID number or something like that at the
Right.
government. Yeah,
Thank you. And I take it you've never worked on the actual preparation of public accounts for Ontario?
that's correct.
And you've never been hired to assist in the preparation of public accounts for Ontario?
That's correct.
Okay. Now, I've heard you say it a few times last week that the disagreements between the experts in this matter isn't really about the actual figures in the public accounts or government records. The dispute, if I characterize it this way, is what you do with them. Does that sound generally fair?
Yeah, I think that's generally fair. There have been some typographical errors I've identified versus Bodwin and Smart identified. I think we're in agreement on those, but I think, yeah, in general, it's not so much what the numbers are, but what you do with them.
Right. I
Yeah.
think you mentioned terms like allotment, relevancy, apportionment. That's where the disagreements lie.
Yes,
Okay. So you don't dispute that the actual data or numbers themselves in the various government records are wrong?
oh, you mean like in the public accounts or something?
That's right.
No, I have no basis to dispute the public accounts. That's correct. And I don't dispute the public accounts.
Great. So generally, they're reliable for the purposes of what we're dealing with today.
I think they're reliable for the purposes for which they were prepared.
That's all right. I mean, reliable in terms of accuracy.
Yeah,
Council, excuse me, I'm missing the ends of your sentences. Your
Oh.
voice drops a bit, so I don't hear the last word or two.
My apologies.
Okay. But maybe Mr. Hutchings did. Sure. You said I have no basis to dispute. I think they're reliable for something. Then you had a question.
I said I think they're reliable for the purposes for which they are prepared.
Right. And what I'm trying to get to is that you're not disputing whether, this 6 should have been an 8 or, the accuracy in terms of the data.
That's correct.
Thank you. There was a term you used several times last week. It was GDP.
Yes.
So we pulled a definition out. It's at tab 2 of the binder, sir.
Okay.
I pulled this from the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, and I believe you've cited that same organization a few times in your materials. You're aware of this organization?
Yes, I'm aware of the OECD.
Okay, I'm just going to read this out because it's fairly short. And this definition reads, gross domestic product, GDP, is the standard measure of the value added created through the production of goods and services in a country during a certain period. As such, it also measures the income earned from that production or the total amount spent on the final goods and services, less imports. Now, in your understanding, is that a fair definition of GDP?
I would say it is a definition. It's not the one I would have expected to see from, say, a macroeconomics book or a general intro to econ textbook. But I don't disagree with it. I think it's expressed in words that I wouldn't use to describe it, but it seems all right. And the definition continues of being the single most important indicator to capture economic activity. So I'm not sure for what purpose they're providing this definition, but
Okay,
It's in the ballpark. I think probably as an economist, I would think of it as, to go back to an equation, consumption plus investment plus government expenditure plus net exports. Kind of what I would have expected to see. That's, I think, the Econ 101 way, but I guess these are other words that say the same thing. So
so I'm going to try it in a layman's term. GDP is a value for services and products. Is that generally accurate?
I would say it's the value of the kind of total output of the economy.
Okay.
Um,
And that captures a large, diverse collection of economic activity.
yes,
And I think you just mentioned it. Is it one of the common measures to compare how entire economies are doing?
yes, it's often put together for that purpose. It's kind of, what is the total output, if you will, of the economy?
Right. It's very broad.
Yes,
And it measures value created by individuals, corporations, and government spending.
it measures all value created, I guess, no matter how it's created.
Right. So it does include value created by individuals, corporations, and government spending.
Yes, I'm hesitating only if there's some other category I should be thinking of that's not popping in my head. I don't
Oh.
disagree. It includes those things.
Right. I didn't mean it was exclusive. Sorry. It
Okay,
includes
yeah.
those three things.
Yeah,
Thank you.
sure.
Actually, basically, almost every producing or spending actor in an economy contributes to the GDP.
That's right.
Thank you. And this concept has been around for quite some time, I presume.
Yes.
Thank you. Okay, so if you go to tab 3 of the binder,
Okay. Yep.
these are tables 1 and 2 from your October 31st reply report.
Okay.
Okay, do you recognize them?
Yes.
Now, in table 1, I think you may have touched upon this in your chief, but I just wanted to highlight it again. In table 1, on the right-hand column, at the bottom, you have row F. Do you see that?
Yes.
Difference as a percent of BNS estimate. And if you go to the first column after that, which is the second column, nominal, you have a number 4.3%.
That's correct.
And thank you. And I think what you're doing here is you're expressing the difference between your approach and Professors Bodway and Smart on the nominal revenues. Is that right?
That's right.
And it's a fairly small percentage difference.
Yes.
Okay. And in table 2, using the same columns and rows, row F, difference as a percent of Bodway and Smart estimate, nominal value, you have a 90.9%. Do you see that?
Yes.
And I think you're expressing that there is a significant difference between you and Professor Smart and Bodway on the nominal expenses.
That's correct.
And I think you've already confirmed this morning, but the difference in that 90.9% is mostly comprised as a result of the different approaches you've taken.
That's right.
Okay. And if we put up figure 11 at tab 4 of the binder, this is figure 11 is from the Professors Smart and Bodway nominal values report of August 2023. And I think this may have been part of your slide deck as well, but do you recognize this figure?
I do.
Okay. And you see that, I think will you agree that the most critical divergence between yourself and Professor Smart and Bodway in the respective Crown resource expenses occurs post 1945?
These charts don't show my approach to expenses. This is just their approach to expenses.
Right. I may have rephrased that wrong.
Okay,
Sorry.
sure. Go ahead.
Would you agree that the most critical divergence between yourselves and Professor Smart and Bodway is the treatment of Crown resource expenses post 1945.
I think in terms of quantitative impact, the single largest difference is our treatment of expenses after 1945.
Right.
Yes, this next kind of runner-up is the transportation expenses. And then I think everything else is relatively small, as I discussed last week.
Right. And in terms of that first item, the
Yes.
bulk of that is forestry expenses post 1945.
Yes, I think forestry, in fact, even forestry after 1960, I think is, I forget the numbers I had last week, 80–90% of the difference is all encapsulated there.
Right. Okay, thank you. And just to clarify, 1945 is when you started to apply your fixed expense ratio of 31.4%.
Yeah, I think it was 31.9%, but yes, that's when I changed to a different approach. That's correct.
Right. It's a fixed expense ratio.
That's correct.
Thank you. Okay, so we are going to look at some of the general concepts you applied. and
Okay.
On deciding what was relevant or not, and then we're going to see how you apply that to some concept, to some specific items, and then we'll look at your decision to apply a flat rate after 1945. I'm just giving you a heads up. where we're
Sure.
going. Okay, if you go to tab 6 of the binder,
Probably tab 5 or tab 6.
tab 6.
Okay, sure.
We have 2 pages from your January 31st, 2002 report. Do you recognize those?
I do.
And I just wanted to focus in on those 2 footnotes, footnotes 11 and 12. And what we've done in the 3rd page in that tab is we've kind of copied them into a single page. You see that?
Yes.
And you've said in these footnotes that you understand the relevant guidelines include, and then you quote from the stage 1 reasons at paragraph 551, and if for footnote 12, paragraphs 552. That's what you've done?
That's right.
Okay. And you're aware that the partial judgments were amended by the Court of Appeal?
Yes.
Okay. If you turn to tab 7 of the binder and go to page 9. You'll see are you there, sir?
I think, oh, there's page numbers at the top. Okay, sorry. I was
yes.
counting pieces of paper. Okay,
Oh,
I'm there. Yep.
you'll see a paragraph number 3, the court further adjudges. Do you see that?
Uh-huh.
Okay. And B reads, for purposes of determining the amount of net Crown resource-based revenues in a particular period, and it has a subcategory I,
Uh-huh.
relevant revenues to be considered are Crown resource-based revenues arising directly or in a closely related way to the use, sale, or licensing of land, which can include the waters in the treaty territory. You see that?
I do.
Okay. And
Sorry,
for
sir, I'm just catching up. What did you
Sure.
read from page 9?
3B sub I.
Thank you.
And sub 2I talks about the expenses, and it reads, relevant expenses to be considered
Mhm.
are Crown expenses related to collecting, regulating, and supporting relevant revenues. See that?
I do.
So from your footnotes, as well as your testimony, can I take it that you took directions from these passages when you began your work of deciding what was relevant or not in terms of expenses and revenues?
So the passages on page 9 or the passages in the stage 1 reasons?
Well, I was referring to page 9. Did
Okay.
you use the reasons as opposed to the Court of Appeal amended?
No,
reasons?
I believe I cited both, just the footnotes you gave me earlier cited the reasons, but they're largely the same as what's left here, so.
This is an
Yes.
amended version that the Court of Appeal
Mhm.
issued. So, but which one did you use to do your work off of?
Oh, I used both. The wording is slightly different, but I'm happy to use these. I cited the reasons, not the judgment in the passage you cited earlier from my report, but I'm fine using these as well.
Was there any distinction that you came apart between the two versions?
No,
And were there any other instructions, say from plaintiff's counsel, giving you further guidance on which revenues or expenses you should deem relevant or not relevant?
no,
Right, so you worked out the judgment and this amended version.
that's correct.
Thank you. Now, I'm not going to ask you any legal interpretations. I'm just going to ask you your understanding for the next of these passages on my next.
Mr. Hahn, can I just ask a question? Your last question was, so you worked off the judgment and this amended version. Was paragraph 551 the judgment or the reasons? I wasn't looking at the tab 6.
There's the reasons.
Oh, right. The footnotes refer to the reasons.
Right, but tab 6, which you showed the witness, is reasons, right?
That's right.
And then you said, was there a difference between the paragraph 551, which are the reasons, and this amended version?
Right.
But this is not an amended version of the reasons.
That's right.
The
So let me just-
judgment.
I'll just re-ask that question, just make sure we're. Did you, in your mind,
Mhm.
was there any distinction from what you cited from the stage 1 reasons and the amended order at page 9, you see at tab 7?
In my, no, I didn't take them to be meaning different things. Like the order of the words are a little different, where relevant comes. This one starts with relevant is. The other version says these things are relevant, but I think they're the same list of things. So I didn't see a distinction.
Okay, thank you.
Is that helpful?
Your Honor, does that clarify?
Thanks. Yeah,
Okay.
I just wanted to make sure that was responsive to Mr. Hong's question.
Thank you. So I'm back to page 9 of tab 7. Are you there?
Yes.
Okay. In the 3B2I, under the expenses,
Uh-huh.
it says related to collecting, regulating, and supporting. Do you see that? It's the second line.
Uh-huh.
Okay,
Oh, you sorry, yes.
yes.
Okay.
And when you were doing your work and you looked at this, this provision, did you understand expenses needed to meet all 3 categories or just one of those categories?
Just one of those categories.
Okay. And between the I and 2I, they may look similar, but there's a slight distinction. So I wanted to ask you about it in terms of,
Sorry, what's 2I? I only have 3BI. I don't, 2I? I don't have a 2I
I have
part.
3A, B, and then there's 2 subparagraphs. I call them I and 2I, but
Oh, okay, got it. Got
I,
it. Okay.
is there a better term I should use?
No, no, no.
Okay.
Now that you say it, it makes sense. I was looking for a 2.I
Oh.
and I was a little confused. My bad.
Maybe the question answered again, then, if you were looking.
So I was referring to 3B and I guess a double I.
Okay.
And does your answer remain the same?
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you, counsel. So there's a slight difference between single I and double I. I'm just gonna take you to it and I want to get your understanding. If in the single I,
Uh-huh.
it says relevant revenues to be considered are Crown resource-based revenues arising, and here's the distinction, directly or in a closely related way. Do you see that?
Yes.
And for the expenses, it just says in a double I, relevant expenses to be considered are Crown expenses related to. So it doesn't have directly, the restriction directly or in a closely related way. Do you see that?
I see that the words directly or in a closely related way aren't there,
That's right. Okay,
but
So my-
there are other differences between the 2 paragraphs.
that's right.
Oh,
I
okay.
just want to focus on this
Sure.
phrase. So my question to you is that when you were understanding what your directions and instructions would be on
Uh-huh.
deciding what's included and what's not included, did the fact that those words were not in double I make any distinction for you?
No, I didn't. I didn't consider those words in double I. In double I focused on that it has to do one of those three things to relevant revenues, which, then kind of brings us back up to single I as to how we define relevant revenues.
Okay, so you didn't turn your mind specifically to those words, directly or closely related.
No, I know that's correct. I did not read this to say our crown expenses arise. I wouldn't even know how to read in like arising. Yeah, no, I applied them as written here on the screen. I'm just highlighting there were other differences, not just the absence of the arising directly language.
Sorry, I'm a little confused. You just said I applied them as read on the screen. Could you explain that?
Oh, sure. I'm just saying I applied them as they are written, I guess, on the screen. I didn't take parts of one definition and put in the other or anything like that.
So maybe I'll be more specific. Did you read the double I provision as not requiring expenses to be direct or closely related to?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Did you read the double I provision,
Uh-huh.
which is expenses,
Uh-huh.
as not requiring expenses to be directly or closely related to collecting, regulating, and supporting relevant revenues? Because those words are missing.
That's right. So I did not read it that way. I read it the way it's written.
I'm not sure I understand your question, I have to admit.
Right. Okay.
Let me see if I get what you're asking. In the paragraph about revenues, the judgment reads that revenues to be considered are those revenues which arise directly or in a closely related way to three things. Okay.
That's right.
And when it gets to expenses, the words arise directly or in a closely related way, those words are not used. You're saying the words that describe what revenues to include are not the same words as the descriptors for expenses. Is that your point?
Right. So there seems
And
to be.
I'm just saying, is that your point that you're asking the witness if he noticed that or considered it or?
Considered it.
Yeah, maybe I'm stumbling with the question. I considered it the way it's written. So the fact the words are different meant I
Okay.
considered them differently.
But you excluded indirect expenses.
I excluded indirect.
Expenses, from my understanding of your evidence.
Well, I included expenses that were related to indirect revenues because indirect revenues were not relevant revenues. That didn't have anything to do with the expense being direct or not. It's the second part of 2I or I2, a double I, sorry, double I. It's the second part that expenses related to collecting, regulating, and supporting relevant revenues. Given I don't consider indirect revenues to be relevant revenues, neither do Professors Bodway and Smart, expenses related to or indirect revenues aren't relevant because the relevant expenses, right, are expenses related to relevant revenues. If we define relevant revenues as direct revenues, then relevant expenses are expenses related to direct revenues and not those related to indirect revenues. So it's the revenues that are direct or indirect, not the expenses. Does that help?
Well, there is a distinction there. So
Sure.
Thank you for your explanation. But you can have an indirect expense that leads to a direct revenue. So in that case, well, how would you classify that?
I don't know I don't think I've talked about direct and indirect expenses yet. What's the definition of an indirect expense?
Well, I was going to ask you. I was going to ask you that.
Sorry.
I was trying to understand how you're classifying expenses. So
I called them relevant, not relevant, and partially relevant.
But
Yeah.
in terms of direct and indirect, you use that distinction for revenues,
That's right.
but you don't use that for expenses. Is that what you're telling me?
That's correct.
I'm just going to catch up if that's okay.
Absolutely.
Makes a world of difference.
Sorry.
The light, I didn't, that's hard to read up here.
Thanks very much. Go ahead.
Thank you, Your Honor. Okay, so we could take a closer look at that. If you turn to tab 8 of the binder, we're going to examine some of these, I guess, rules and restrictions you came up with.
Mhm.
And we're going to start with this one at page 6. This is from your January 31st, 2022 report.
Okay.
Are you there at tab 8, sir?
Yes.
Okay. At subparagraph C,
Okay.
you wrote, the relevant Crown expenses are expenses that support a relevant Crown revenue, including those that support the collection of such revenues, consistent with the court's earlier reasons. Resource-related activities that did not lead to the Crown collecting resource revenues do not generate relevant Crown revenues, and therefore any expenses related to those activities are not relevant Crown expenses for the purposes of my calculation.
Mhm.
And I think that's what you just tried to explain to us just a minute ago, right?
Right. This is the matching. If there's no revenue, so relevant revenue doesn't exist, then there's not an expense related to that revenue.
So let me just try an example of this. If the Crown has an expense that supports or protects the resource, my example would be getting rid of insects that are destroying trees. That helps the industry, and in turn, it may increase Crown revenues. But under your restriction, because it does not directly lead to the Crown collecting a dollar, you have excluded it under this rule. Is that right?
No, what I would say is because it doesn't directly lead to a direct Crown resource revenue, right? It might lead to a forestry company being more profitable and paying more income tax, which is not a relevant revenue. Then, it's not related to regulating, collecting, supporting the direct revenues we included.
Yeah, I think we're getting to the same thing. So I
Okay.
just wanted to make sure. The Crown can have expenses that support the resource itself, forestry, mining.
Mhm.
But you're saying unless that expense links directly to money coming in, you don't count it.
That's correct. Unless it's related to a relevant revenue, I don't include it. That's right.
Well, then my example is if you want to get rid of an infestation of bugs that are destroying trees,
Mhm.
and it helps the logging industry, but there's no direct dollar associated with that coming in, that's excluded.
No direct dollar associated with the dollars we measure. Yeah, that's correct.
Okay. And I'm going to continue on with your C on page 7. Do you see that? And you say,
Page 7.
sorry, I'm just going to continue reading from where I ended.
Oh,
there.
okay, sure.
You say,
Uh-huh.
another group of expenses not relevant for my analysis are those that relate to resource revenue generation in an only indirect manner.
Yes.
And I think that's kind of another step of what we were just talking about.
That's right.
And for the purposes of your work, you were the one who decided whether there was sufficient linkage to a direct resource revenues. You were making those decisions.
That's right.
Okay. You didn't have a set list of specific activities you were working off of. You were making the judgment call on a line by line item.
I mean, the activities would be the collecting, supporting, regulating of the direct crown revenues, but you know, the accounts don't say which line items do those things. So that was the test I was applying as I went line by line through the public accounts, because the public accounts don't say, you know, this one collects revenues or something like that. Does that make sense?
My question is more like you weren't relying on this third party body or organization that has a list of activities that explains which ones should be direct
Oh.
or relevant. You were making the decisions.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
In this framework. I see what you're saying. That's right.
That's right. Okay. And another restriction you applied can be found that let's go to tab 10 of the binder.
Tab 10.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. This is from your,
It's also from my opening report.
yeah, that's what I figured. I just wanted to make sure. This is paragraph 105. And you wrote
Yes.
the expenses themselves must be undertaken with an objective chance of revenue generation. This means that net positive crown revenues are reasonably expected, or at least possible.
Mhm.
Because the expenses are related to revenues, and I have excluded general revenues, see discussion 4A. I also exclude general expenses.
That's right.
Okay. And this objective chance seems a bit vague, but I take it that means it doesn't have to be 100% guaranteed revenues.
That's right. I think I have an example somewhere else in the report about, say, you wanted to sell a block of land. Thought it might fetch, I forget the numbers I used, so I'll make up new numbers. You'll get $1,000 for it. It's going to cost you $500 to survey it. That makes sense, you know, because you're going to try to sell it. But say next year, the market tanks, nobody wants to live there anymore, and the price is now $200. You may end up at a loss, but you still count the expense. So it doesn't have to be positive. The way this is applied in practice is really focused on those things with no chance of revenue generation. So the most prominent example, the free grant lands we talked about earlier. If you're giving it away for free, by definition, it cannot be positive. Right? Because you're going to incur, you're at best zero if somehow you could give it away for free without incurring any expenses. But in all likelihood, you're negative. So that's how it was applied in practice. But there's another example, I forget where, because it's just one page. I thought nearby to this paragraph about the survey example.
Right, I do remember your survey example.
Okay.
So you've clarified my next question, which is it can't be 0% chance of, like you just explained, if you do an activity with, as you just judge it, 0% chance of generating revenues, you exclude it.
Right, because if there's zero revenues, it's the same thing as saying there are no revenues. And so there's no relevant revenues for the expenses to be related to.
Right. So what about anything above 0% chance? 25% chance, 30% chance?
Oh, in practice, I include everything. That's like the conversation we had about surveys.
Okay. Now, if you remember back to the words of the amended order, collecting, regulating, and supporting, do you remember those?
I do.
Okay. And I think you've already admitted today that only one of these three needs to be met for an expense to be relevant. Oh, sorry. Only one of these categories needs to be
Satisfied.
satisfied. I was looking for the word. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Not all three.
That's right. So like an example would be like in the arbitration papers, there's a heading there like departmental expense of collections. Taken on its face, that's only related to collecting.
Right.
But I would include it because it's related to collecting.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
Okay.
Thank you. That's what I assumed the answer was. Now, if you turn to tab 11 of the binder, please.
Okay.
Okay.
Oh,
This
boy.
is from your slide deck, which is, I think it's exhibit 11, but I've actually forgot by now, but
Forget.
you recognize this slide?
I
It's
do.
slide 155.
Yeah, this one's soft, but it's a little easier to read sideways. So I'm just gonna open it in the other one. if that's
Not a
okay.
problem.
Otherwise, all these papers are gonna fall on me in a minute. Okay,
Just let me know when you're there.
I'm there.
Okay. And you gave this as an example of your analysis, but I want to take a look exactly what happened here. So on the column on the left, it says line item.
Yep.
And that's the activity that you're analyzing.
Yes, that's how it was labeled in the public accounts.
Okay. And the third column over says my treatment.
That's right.
And that's how you listed whether you included something or you excluded the expense.
Yes, or I treated it as overhead, which is the shorthand for partially included.
Okay. On this page, if you look to the third last row, 78,
Yes,
I see legal assistance enforcing mining act. Do you see that?
I do.
And you excluded it.
That's right.
Sorry, I missed where we got to.
So it's the items are numbered and I'm going to number 78.
Got it. Thank you.
On slide 155.
Right. So
Yeah.
legal
Yeah,
assistance enforcing mining act and you excluded it.
That's correct.
Okay. If you turn to the next page, this is your slide 156.
Okay,
Okay, I'm going to go to item number 88. It says legal investigations and reports.
that's right.
Yep, and you excluded that.
That's correct.
And I'm going to go to item 94,
Yes,
legal investigations,
that's right.
and you excluded that as well.
That's right.
Okay. Leaving aside the expenses and revenues determination right now, is it your understanding that enforcing laws and activities to ensure people comply with laws fall squarely within a regulating activity?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Sure. Is it your understanding that the activity of enforcing laws
Mhm.
and ensuring people comply with laws, wouldn't that fall within regulating an activity?
Sure, I think the legal system is about regulating activities, kind of like the administration of justice line item that showed up in the arbitration papers, 1850 to 97. But that's not about regulating a direct resource revenue. That's about regulating mining, not regulating direct resources or putting in place regulations to collect direct revenues.
So when you excluded these items,
Uh-huh.
it's not because they are not regulating an activity. You're saying they don't tie directly to direct resource revenue. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, so I'm saying, I forget which page it was. Oh,
It's
page
one-
9 of tab 7. It doesn't relate to regulating relevant revenues, where relevant revenues are the direct crown resource revenues. Right, it might relate to mining writ large, but it doesn't relate to regulating the mining specific revenues.
Sorry, I'm having trouble understanding that distinction you're making.
Sure.
So how would you regulate a revenue?
How would you regulate a revenue?
That's the distinction you're making,
Yeah.
right?
Sure, I mean, this would be like the collections, the expenses of the inspectors and like sticking with these couple of pages we have here on mining. You know, line 74 there on slide 155. Explorations, investigations and inspections of mines generally, that probably includes, you know, the regulations to collect the mining profits tax, those sorts of things. So that's what I would look into, you know, on line 81 there on slide 156, investigations into unpaid accounts, that's going to lead to some revenue. Rather than, you know, how do we as a society want to approach mining, which we might have to answer that whether or not we charged direct crown resource revenues.
So Mr. Hutchings,
Yeah.
isn't every activity you just described collecting fall under that category?
Doesn't every,
You're talking about collecting fees and taxes.
I mean, I guess that could be the regulations about the collection. Presumably the investigators and the inspectors have some regulation they're meant to follow. That's what I mean by regulating the revenues. There's to be a tie to the revenue separate from the activity generally, because regulating the activity generally leads to other benefits that we're not including, the indirect Crown resource revenues. I forget the other language, but non-economic benefits generally.
So I'm sorry. So
Mhm.
you've described activities that relate to collecting Crown revenues.
Mhm.
And you're saying that when you apply the category of regulating, you've also restricted that to collecting Crown revenues. Is that what I'm hearing?
No, I mean, I think what these explorations, investigations, and inspections, that's line 74 of slide 155, that's related to the people investigating and inspecting mines. That's broader than just the collection agents collecting mining profits tax, but I include that because it's related to the direct resource revenue. Yeah, I'm not sure I can parse out, that $27,783, how much is regulating, collecting, supporting. But some mix of all of that is in there. But again, I only need knowing that each of those activities is probably happening in that $27,783. That's the basis to include it. I'm taking the one I include as an example.
Right. But they're all linked to collecting Crown resource revenues.
I just said collecting, supporting, and regulating Crown resource revenues. Like, I don't know how a mining, inspector.
What I'm getting to.
Sure, yeah,
Oh,
but
sorry,
perhaps we're
sorry. I
talking
didn't
past each other. I don't mean to be
I didn't mean to
difficult.
cut you off.
Yeah.
Please.
No. If you want to rephrase the question, I feel like I was talking past you there.
Yeah. Every activity you've described
Uh-huh.
relates, as you've said, to the collection of Crown resource revenues. So my question is, it appears to me that there really is no regulating category aside from that very narrow set of activities that's already falls under collecting.
Sorry, going back to the example of the mining inspectors, they do more than just collect the Crown revenue. They're also involved in the supporting and regulating of that direct activity. I mean, I haven't indicated here, I guess on the side, like I don't have a separate categorization of, regulate, support, collect. Did it serve one or all of those purposes? Again, if it served one of those, that was enough. So I guess I'm on line 74, I'm saying they do more than just collect the revenues.
Well, is there a line item which is regulating but not collecting that you've included?
Is there a line that is, well, I mean, a lot of that would fall under, say, line 77, the salaries of the mining branch generally, which I allocate on an overhead basis. I would imagine a lot of those regulation functions are head office type functions. They're partially relevant and a fairly big ticket expense. I think mining recorders down there at the bottom, line 80, in addition to collecting recorders fees, they're going to be regulating, who has claims to what areas and the support of collecting those revenues. If we go over the page, allowance expenses for making a survey, inspected, I guess line 92, this is an overhead one, but inspectors of a mining inspector, expenses of a mining inspector, I'm sorry. So a lot of those are going to show up in these overhead type expenses that the regulation can further both the direct Crown resource revenues and other activities. If we allocate the salaries at the head office proportionally as overhead, as I do here, it seems logical that some of those people's salaries are spent regulated.
So you're lumping regulation in with the overhead generally.
No, looking at the two slides here, that's the example I can point to. I'm not.
What if there's an legal investigation
Mhm.
on how much a person is owing
What
under
if-
the Mining Act?
There's a legal investigation as to how much someone is owing under the Mining Act.
Right.
Owing to,
The Crown.
Oh, so like say Ontario had to sue someone who wasn't paying their taxes, is that the idea?
Or you just wanted to see if someone's not paying the proper fees or permits.
Um, if you're going to count the revenue that would arise from, say, a settlement or something,
Right.
in this
but
example
wouldn't-
of you're investigating someone who's not paying, if you're then going to count any potential settlement, you might count the expenses.
And wouldn't
but-
that be a legal investigation?
But I don't think we include as revenues anything that might arise from settlements or other things like that.
Sorry, it's not a settlement, but if someone owes fees
Uh-huh.
and they end up paying them, that's not a settlement.
If someone owes, right, but I mean, that's, I think what the mining recorder's offices do, right? They record amounts that are owed and send out statements of account and collect on those.
Okay. Back to that.
Okay,
Let's go to tab 12. Let's try
tab
this.
12?
Yeah.
Okay,
This is also from your January 2022 report.
yes,
And if you look at paragraph 21,
yes,
the calculation of net revenues does mean that negative results are possible, i.e. that in a given year, the Crown expended more on resource revenue related activities than it collected. As I described below, I consider resource revenue related activities to be those in expectation will generate positive revenues. However, that does not mean they will generate positive revenues. See that?
I do.
And in subparagraph A on the next page is your survey example that you referred to earlier.
Oh, okay. I probably got the numbers wrong, but this is what I had in mind, yes.
Right. So Mr. Hutchings, for any particular activity in a year,
Mhm.
the relevant expenses can exceed revenues. That's what you're saying here. There can be a negative.
Yes,
And for example, relevant expenses could amount to, say, 150% revenues for that year.
yes,
Right. And there's no particular percentage of expenses that suddenly makes them relevant or beyond which not relevant. Like expenses can be 5% of your revenues, they can be 67%, they can be 145%. There's no magic number where all of a sudden they're not relevant because of the percentage.
sorry, yeah, it's not like a circular calculation where I say, oh, given my revenues, here's kind of my first cut at the expenses. What does that ratio look like? Should I then go back and adjust the expenses? No, it's the expenses are relevant because of what they do, which is collect, support, regulate, direct grant resource revenues. What the ratio of those two numbers is a different, it is what it is. To use your example, it could be 5%, it could be 100%.
Right. And
Yes.
that's not determinative of whether the expense itself is relevant or not, right?
No, exactly. The determination of relevancy is made before you can calculate that ratio.
That's right. The percentage doesn't matter.
Sure. It doesn't feed into whether or not it's relevant. You make the relevancy determination. Then you can take the ratio of relevant expenses and revenues.
Right. Okay.
Is that helpful?
Yes.
Okay.
I just want to make sure we understand that, that rule. So because of that, for any given year, the net revenues can be positive, they can be zero, they can be negative.
Yes.
So we're going to take a look at tab 13 of your materials, of my
Okay.
my binder. This is table 17 from your January 2002 report, 22, sorry, my mistake. Do you recognize that table?
I do.
Okay. And when I look at the left-hand column, I see some negative amounts there. Do you see those?
I do.
And I guess those are the years with the negative NCRs,
And NCRRs, yes.
NCRRs, right?
Sure. NCRs would work too, but I've just gotten so programmed now to saying RR that
Yeah,
I think it's something
I
different.
think I got lazy there. I
Yeah.
should have said the second R.
Oh.
So I see that the last negative year is 1880. You see that?
I'm just doing a quick double check. I
Sure, no
don't
problem.
think there are any. Yeah, that looks right to me.
Okay. And there are no more negative years between 1880 and 1945.
That's right.
And after 1945, you apply your expense ratio, so there can't be any negative years.
That's right.
Okay.
There could be zeros, but there can't be negatives.
So the last negative year you said was 1980, 1880.
Yes, Your Honor.
It's I guess for completeness, minus $194 in 1880.
It's a bad year.
In 1880, that was more than $194 today.
I'll bet.
Okay.
And last week you said when you had negative NCRRs figures, you simply added them to the total nominal NCRRs.
Yes. So when I talk about the total nominal NCRRs of 1.043 billion, it's the sum of all these numbers in this table that was on the screen, but is in tab 13 of the binder. And again, as a math person, I say I add the negative numbers, which is the same as subtracting them.
Right.
Subtracting the losses. But I just add them all up.
Okay.
If you want me to like maybe going to type all 170 of them into the calculator, okay.
If you want to do that, it's fine, but probably not necessary.
I'll probably have a fat finger problem along the way.
I say no.
Okay.
I don't think it has that many digits, but okay. So the percentage of the expense doesn't determine it's relevant. And you add the negative NCRRs to the totals.
Mhm.
One more thing, when you do your bring forward rates, you apply those rates to the negative numbers as well, right?
Oh, yes, for the time value of money. Yes.
Right. I think you've used the phrase, $1 today is worth more than $1 tomorrow.
Yes.
And presumably if you have a debt today, that debt is bigger tomorrow. Same principle.
Yes, a loss today is, worse than a loss tomorrow. Yeah, sure.
Now let's talk about the timing of an expense.
So the tiding
Timing.
timing. Okay.
So an expense can be incurred before a corresponding revenue. And I think from your example with the survey costs, that's what you're referring to. You incur costs in year 0, and it could produce revenues in year 2.
Sure.
Right.
Yes, in general, they could occur before. Yeah.
Right. And that doesn't determine whether their expense is relevant or not, just because there's a time delay.
That's correct. I include the survey expenses as they happen, even though the lands that were surveyed may not be sold or leased or stumpage collected upon them for 1 to 10 years. That's right.
And in your example, you even mentioned that the revenue may in fact not even materialize. Right?
That's correct. Yeah.
So if you survey a property and it produces revenue, like I think you just said it, 5 years later, 10 years later, that doesn't determine whether it's relevant.
Yes.
And what happens if you have an expense? No, sorry. Can an expense follow a revenue?
That's a little more tricky.
So I'll give you an example. How about refunds?
Yes, sure. Yeah. Yeah. Obviously, you can't refund the money until you've collected it. So that would be a good example.
Presumably, right?
Yeah.
And I'll give you a more, I guess, expenditure example. When Professor Stiglitz was here 2 weeks ago, he made a reference to the hypothetical carbon reducing machine. I think that's what he called it. Do you remember that example?
Yes, I remember something like I think carbon sequestration, take
Carbon
it out of the air and
That right.
make the planet cleaner. Yes.
Personally, I would just call that a tree, but I don't have a Nobel Prize in climate change. So let's take this theoretical machine
Okay.
that extracts carbon from the air. And let's say the Crown wanted to buy one for $500.
Okay.
And it agrees to pay the vendor $100 per year for 5 years. Are you with me?
Yes.
And then it charges people to extract carbon from the air. And it makes money the first year.
So it is the crown now
Crown.
or the company?
Crown.
The crown. Okay. Okay. Yeah.
And so let's say the Crown receives revenues of $1,000 year one, $1,000 year two, $1,000 year three, and then the market changes or the machine breaks down and it still has payments to go. So that's an example of expenses following the revenue, right?
Yes.
Right. And that would be a valid expense associated with the Crown revenue.
Yeah. If that's how it was booked, I mean, if you're going to take the machine, you might also incur a capital charge at year zero for the $500 and then amortize it over the period. I think it would depend how the crown, in our example, recorded the money. Would it show up in the public accounts as an ordinary or capital expense?
Right. My main point is
Yeah.
that the expense doesn't necessarily have to happen in the same year as the revenue. It can be before, it can be after. You agree with that?
Yeah, it could be, sure.
Okay. And so let's extend that for even a longer period of time. So if the Crown incurred an expense, I'll give you a clear example. Let's say the Crown incurred expenses to rehabilitate and regrow an entire forest to maturity, so it can be used for logging. And this process
Mhm.
can take decades,
Okay.
right? So just because the expense occurs maybe decades before revenues finally come in, that doesn't make the expense relevant. Would you agree?
Relevant or irrelevant?
Irrelevant.
I mean, I think so. As to the point about timing, I might agree, but there still has to be an attribution of that expense to the revenues you want to measure. So is that reforestation just supporting direct Crown resource revenues, or what portion of it is supporting the direct revenues you're measuring, what portion supporting indirect, et cetera?
Right. So let's assume that whatever revenues come in the future
Uh-huh.
would fall under your categories as included.
Okay,
Okay. So the mere fact that the expense occurs maybe decades before
Uh-huh.
doesn't exclude it. It's still directly related to a direct Crown resource revenue.
right. And there would have been the expectation of a positive result, because that's the other part of that. So,
That's right.
okay, so if you expect, to get $100 5 years from now and it's costing you $50 today in real terms, so adjusting for the time value of money, I don't disagree. That's back to our survey example again. You might survey the land today and sell it tomorrow or next year.
Right. And it doesn't change if that 5 years is 70 years.
I think it's 70 years. No, probably not. I think it's a more challenging task to undertake how you know that's going to, in expectation, generate positive revenues, but in principle, I would agree. I mean, I think you'd have a hard time as economists, I'd say, making a market for that, because not a lot of people are prepared to wait 70 years for a payoff.
Right. But in
Okay.
this case, the plaintiffs, I think Professor Stiglitz explained, they have a very long perspective.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Now, it's 3 o'clock. I'm about to move on to another issue. Perhaps this might be a good time for the afternoon break.
Very good. 15.
This court will recess until 3:15. This court is now resumed. You may be seated.
Mr. Hutchings, you could turn to tab 14 of the binder.
Sure.
What you'll see is your slide 109. And it refers to cost allocation. You see that?
I do.
Now, you've identified the 3 steps to the procedure there. And it says, 1, identify costs to be allocated. 2, select a basis for allocation. And 3, allocate overhead according to the proportion of the basis for allocation in each quote bucket.
Yes, that's what it says.
So let me, and then you flip over to the next page.
Okay.
Now, before we go into here, let me just summarize that procedure. Basically, what you were saying from this slide is that where someone achieves multiple purposes from an activity, you allocate portions of the cost to those different purposes. Is that kind of the general idea?
Yeah, that's the general idea of cost allocation. The simplest example is our, many factories with the head office. Those costs have to be allocated once and only once to each of the factories.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, and now we're looking at slide 133 from your deck,
Okay.
and it's titled Considering Transportation Expenses.
Sure.
And your first bullet says, I exclude railway aid and colonization road expenses
Uh-huh.
from my analysis because these expenditures were undertaken by the Crown with a view to a very broad set of Crown objectives.
That's
And
correct.
then- Yes, and in second bullet, you say these expenditures are undertaken in pursuit of other objectives such as indirect Crown revenues, resource rents, and other social benefits. See that?
I do.
Okay. Now, let's start at a high level.
Sure.
You've identified these transportation expenses as one of the, I guess, significant disagreements between you and Professor Smart and Boldway, the amount of the expenses.
That's correct.
Okay. And you say, as we saw here, these railways and roads achieve a multitude of other purposes.
That's correct.
But you don't dispute that these roads and railways were used by the resource industries, at least in the RST area, at least to some degree.
I don't dispute that the railways were used by participants in the resource industry. I agree with them. And I don't think they dispute that the railways didn't pay any direct Crown resource revenues as either of us calculate them. So again, they're used by participants in the industry, but they're not attached to any direct Crown resource revenue. In fact, as I discussed last week, they're kind of associated with a zero. You would expect railway companies to pay for land access. And, given we're not charging them, they kind of fall into that zero bucket.
Okay, so what you're saying now is that they may support the industry as a whole, but
Mhm.
because they don't support a direct Crown resource revenues, that's why you excluded them.
I would say that's one of the reasons. And my report, I put a little more meat on the bones, if you will, than what's just on the slide. And if we want to go to my opening report, paragraph 108B, I say, first, railways generate no Crown resource revenues because they are not resources. They provide transportation services and generate revenue typically in a fee-for-service manner. They do not generate Crown revenue through specific levies, or certainly not through resource revenue specific levies. So again, that's number one.
Can you give me your page reference, please?
Sure. 77 of 127 of my
Are
solo
these in the
opening
sli- Are
report.
these in the, in your report, page
Yeah.
77?
the one that looks like this, I'm gonna get the exhibit number wrong if I
Got it.
try to remember it.
This is your January 2022.
Yes, that's the one.
I think that's Exhibit 8, Your Honor.
Exhibit
Thank
four.
you.
There we go. It was somewhat less than 10, so I know I'll only create confusion
That
if I
narrows
give
it
the
down.
wrong number. Yeah. And then second, as I go on to elaborate in that paragraph, they serve many other functions. And, as I say, a bit more meat on the bones there, but that's summarizing. I think what's the slide summarizes that there are both of those reasons.
Well, let's clarify that.
Sure.
Under your reason 1, the one you just outlined, you're saying that wasn't enough of reason to exclude it entirely.
No, I think it's enough. If they don't generate a direct Crown resource revenue as we measure them, and this is going back to the judgment that you put in front, page 9 of one of the tabs in here, right? A revenue related to, or sorry, an expense related to collecting, regulating, supporting a relevant revenue. If there is no relevant revenue, right, we're not counting any direct Crown revenues from railway, then there's no relevant expense. 'Cause
Right.
these expenses aren't related to a revenue.
And
And moreover, there's the other point of, because you kind of naturally want to answer the question, right? Well, if there's no revenue, why would the Crown incur the expense? Well, they incur it because of all these other broad activities. So I think either one is really getting to the same point about the mismatch. But it's not like I needed both or either or one. It's not. Either is, I think, sufficient here for the point.
well, that's the part that confuses me.
Sure.
If it's 1,
Mhm.
then your discussion about other objectives and purposes doesn't matter.
If it's right, I mean,
I'm sorry, I missed it. If it's
Yeah.
one,
So I want to understand what you're saying.
Mhm.
The railroad expenses and road expenses do not lead directly to a Crown resource revenue. Is that right?
yeah, to a
And for
direct
that-
Crown resource revenue as we measure them. That's right.
And for that reason, they are excluded.
Right. If
Right.
if there's no relevant revenue, then the expense can't be related to that revenue.
Right, and that's how you apply your rule.
Yes.
And once you do that, like, that's why I don't understand, why is it even any consideration? Why are you talking about proportion, other purposes? That's not the reason why you excluded this revenue.
Well, I think they're kind of two sides of the same coin, right? Because they don't support this revenue, they support all these other revenues. I'm just trying to explain. You might, a natural point of curiosity might be, well, why would someone build these railways if they don't lead to direct revenues? Answer, they lead to all these other things.
So
So the two, if it doesn't relate to the first one, then it must relate to the other items. I'm just showing that that's true, right? I've satisfied the first, I have that list in the equation that was in words of increase in direct Crown revenues, increase in indirect Crown revenues, and other benefits, that balancing equation. There's nothing that associates with the top line when it comes to transportation expenses. And I guess just to be thorough, I'm double checking here to say, yeah, there's nothing that associates there, and it associates with all the other things. So I'm checking all the boxes. But that's why in my report, I do say, first, they generate no Crown resource revenue. And that's how I start.
well, that's how I read it. That's how I thought you excluded railroads and railroads.
That's correct.
Right. That's why when you did the cost allocation, I didn't see a cost allocation percentage wise or breakdown, but you've already excluded it on the other reason.
Yes.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah,
I guess basically, if you look at the question I posed at the end of this slide you have up on the screen, which is slide 133, must return to the question of how does this expense relate to the relevant revenues included? The answer is it doesn't.
well, that's what I mean. You're not doing a cost allocation. Here.
That's correct.
You've excluded it.
That's correct.
Okay. And this also comes up, if you turn to tab 16, 1.6,
Okay,
this is paragraph 117 from your January 2022 report.
yes, okay.
Okay, 117A, you
Uh-huh.
talk about excluding the fire response expenses. I'm just going to read it.
Yep.
It says the Ontario government passed the Forest Fire Prevention Act in 1917. As part of the act, the government began collecting a specific tax aimed at suppressing forest fires.
Yep.
Therefore, I include all fire-related expenses into 1917, after which point I exclude all fire-related spending. See that?
I do.
Okay.
But I don't as easily.
I'm sorry.
It's
It's on
tab 16
of the.
I've got
the
16.
bind.
One,
Yes.
paragraph 117,
Yes,
and it's the first subparagraph A.
thank you.
Okay. And then you expand upon those reasons in your reply report of October. Is that the next tab, tab 17?
If I can just, I think my friend said this question that Hutchings with paragraph 117 excluded expenses, but the response that he was reading from is that he does include some of it. I'm not sure if I'm confusing matters, but
Yeah, I can't remember my exact words, but that's
we've
fine.
got it
I
on-
didn't,
You want to look at the.
What time is your time?
Talk-
What is your
talk
time?
about
reference?
Excluding?
Yep.
Excluding the expenses,
so
but
let's,
it's about including.
so, sir, go back to tab 16,
Okay,
117 paragraph sub A. See that?
oh, tab 16, paragraph 117. Yes,
Yes.
Okay.
Right, just where we were just
yeah,
were.
yeah, see it now.
So the way I read this is that you excluded fire-related expenses after 1917. That's what you're explaining here.
That's right. So I include them until 1917, then I exclude them.
Okay.
But
that's I
what the
meant.
paragraph
Thanks for the
says.
clarification.
Yep.
Turn to tab 17.
Okay,
Paragraph 90.
okay,
This is speaking on the exact same topic.
okay.
But you continue on. I'm going to go to the second last line. It's 3 lines from the bottom of that paragraph. Do you see it? I then exclude.
Yes,
I then exclude these expenses after this point. You're referring to 1917.
Uh-huh.
Because I also exclude the fire-specific taxes.
that's right.
I remain of the opinion that wholly excluding these expenses is the most accurate approach. Okay,
Yes, this is just, I think, refreshing what I said in the passage we read earlier from the earlier report. I don't think there's any difference here.
Right.
Yeah, okay.
so the exclusion of the fire-related expenses. Let me rephrase this. Nowhere in the amended Court of Appeal order does it specify that for a relevant Crown resource expense, the money has to come from any particular source.
That's correct.
Okay,
I would just say for any relevant Crown resource revenue related expense.
Right.
It doesn't come, because it's not resource related on the expense side, it's resource revenue related.
right,
Right, okay, yeah, just so we're on the same page there.
okay. And well, do you know what the consolidated revenue fund is?
Yes, it's basically the bank account, if you will, of the province.
Right, I've heard the term public purse.
Sure.
You've heard that, okay.
But yeah, I agree. You know, in general, cash is fungible, right? The money comes in, the money goes out. You might say in your head, right? Oh, I took in this money for this purpose, but that's not mechanically how it works, right? All the monies come in, all the monies go out. there's not a tethering. So even if the government of the day, right, were to say, we're introducing a specific tax for some purpose to pay for some other benefit, there may not be that balancing there. They're going to separately introduce the revenue and separately introduce the expense.
And as far as you're aware, all the Crown resource expenses are paid from this CRF, the same source.
I'd go a step further. I think all Crown expenses, period, are paid from the same source.
Right, there's
Yeah.
no, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there. Did you have something else there?
Nope.
There's no specific resource revenues fund of Ontario that they use to pay relevant expenses, right?
That's correct. I mean, there have been not part of the consolidated revenue fund, but recently, some trusts and so on and so forth set up that are kept separate from the consolidated revenue fund for particular purposes, the Forestry Futures Trust being one of them. But
Right. But generally, all these expenses are paid from the general revenues.
yes.
Okay.
In fact, that's part of this exercise. And while we're all, what Professor Budwin and Smart and I have to undertake is there wasn't a separate accounting done for monies coming to and from the Robinson Superior Treaty.
It's all mixed together.
Exactly.
Okay. Would you turn to tab 18 of the binder?
Sure.
Now, this is slide 164 from your slides deck.
Yep.
Okay. And here you're talking about the fire expenses again.
That's right.
So let me ask you, just generally, preventing forest fires is very important to the forest industry. Would you agree with that?
Yes,
If the forest burned down, there's no forest industry.
that's right.
So there's no dispute that activities preventing forest fire does support, I guess, in some degree, the resource revenues.
There's no dispute that. Right. If the forest burned down, yes, that's right.
Right. And you represented that by your orange box here. That's that portion that leads directly to direct Crown resource revenues.
Right. So, what I'm kind of imagining here is you could think, Ontario's told us here are the four things they care about, right? Communities, property, timber supply, infrastructure. Under each of those, there's at least the three buckets of benefits of direct Crown revenues, indirect Crown revenues, and other economic benefits. So you could imagine this would really be like at least 12 boxes on the other side. Probably each of those benefit from fire expenses. And so, some kind of tracing like exercise or attribution exercise, would put some in each of those 12 buckets.
Right. In this case, at least some of it goes to this orange bucket.
If it was done, a properly done analysis, some would go to that orange bucket. What I'm highlighting here is that in Professor Bodway and Smart's analysis, all of the net expenses end up in that one orange bucket, the one orange bucket related just to timber supply. So in the 12 buckets I postulated on, 0 goes in the other 11 buckets.
Okay, so let's look at this second bucket, as you call it, the green one, indirect Crown resource revenues.
Mhm.
And we're going to look at the blue one as well, other economic benefits.
Sure.
So in your testimony, you've talked about other benefits, as you can even mention here, about public safety, benefit to communities, property, infrastructure. Do you see those bullets there in the middle?
So I see those are the bullets in the middle. I thought you wanted to talk about the green and blue boxes.
I will.
Oh,
Just
okay,
gonna-
okay, yeah.
Sorry.
No worries.
So, and I presume that these are some of these other benefits you're speaking of?
No. Sorry, there's each of the 4 benefits Ontario's identified for us in the middle. Under each of those, you could imagine 3 buckets as on the right-hand side. So, whether or not there's a timber supply, right? If you think about communities, people will buy land. That will lead to a direct Crown resource revenue. People will maybe use that land for farming, something unrelated to timber supply. They'll pay indirect revenues in taxes and HST. They'll have livelihoods and jobs and general prosperity that Professor Mintz and Mr. Reardon talk about, whether or not anybody cuts down a tree. All of those are protected by forest fires. Whether or not there's anyone harvesting trees, the Crown would still have an interest in protecting communities and getting at least those three benefits. So the firefighters are helping with all of that. Same for property. And then I've only shown the example for timber supply, but the four in the middle and the three on the right don't represent the same thing. The three on the right are giving a further expansion of one of the four things in the middle, but they don't kind of circle back, if you will.
Okay, so let me pick up what you just said.
Sure.
So if the government were to undergo activities to prevent forest fires, one of the automatic linked results is also increased to public safety. Right? If you prevent forest fires, you can prevent fires.
Yeah, I think we're in favor of preventing fire. Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
And that is also benefits, like you said, properties and infrastructures from burning down. It's all kind of linked together.
Right. If you prevent fires, you serve all four of those things in the middle.
Right.
Definitely.
Right. And it also protects, as you say, if there's an industry, it protects the industry, it protects their employees, their equipment.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, if there's not a fire, then everybody in that area where there could otherwise have been a fire is better off.
Right.
Open question whether or not the forest ecosystem is better off. I think as we get into forest management, and maybe we should let some fires burn, but for purposes of the middle, I agree with you that, these trees not being on fire certainly at least benefits all of us in this room at the moment.
Right. And you can't separate one from the other. If the Crown stops a forest from burning down, it's not like they can not improve public safety. Those are linked, right? You can't separate them.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Stopping this tree burning down, we can't just save human life and be like, oh, we'd be okay if we all got out, but the building burned down or something. I agree with that.
Right. Okay, and then this on your blue box, employment GDP. We've already spoken that earlier this morning. GDP is very broad and encompassing. I think the way you described it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a measure of, I think economists would think of it as like total economic output. So there's a lot going on there.
I'm going to ask you to turn to tab 19.
Sure.
Of the binder. It's a copy of your slide deck, slide 152. Do you see that?
I do.
Okay. I'm going to go to item 36, titled Exploration and Estimation of Timber Berths.
Yep.
You see that?
I do.
And that's included in your expenses.
That's right.
And item 38 below it, forest ranging, it's also included.
That's right.
Okay. You turn to the next page. It's slide 155. Item 74. Explorations, investigations, and inspections, mines included.
Yes.
Okay. Next page, slide 156. Item 87, allowance expenses, making geological survey. Do you see that?
I do.
And you've included that.
That's right.
And so each one of these items you deemed relevant expenses.
That's right.
Each one of them involved the employment of a person or persons.
The first two certainly. This one says allowance expenses. I don't know if there was a person involved in that or not.
Okay, each one of them added to the GDP.
Yes.
And I think we've already.
Well, sorry. Let me.
I'm sorry.
Oh,
Bless
bless
you.
you. Each one of them, yes, as we calculate GDP, each one of these is a government expenditure. That's right.
Right. In fact, nearly all Crown economic activity or spending creates GDP, adds to the GDP.
No,
Well, when the Crown hires people, pays salaries for people to do things, that adds to the GDP.
it is part of how we estimate GDP. It doesn't necessarily add to it if that person would have been employed instead in private industry. And so we reduced government spending and government taxation and then increased consumption and investment. You know, there might be no balance. So it doesn't necessarily add to it.
I understand your distinction. It's part of the GDP. I'll use a better word.
Right, as we calculate it, it's part of it. This is the one where I forget the person's name. Warren Buffett always had a good example of, he said something like, I could pay 20 people to sit around painting pictures of me. Their salaries would all add to GDP as we measure it. Or I could take that money and invest in a company that would grow and create more jobs. The way we measure GDP, both of those show up the same way. But one is obviously going to add a lot more in the long term than the other.
Right.
Yeah, okay.
Okay. And if a company cuts down trees and makes paper, it adds to the GDP. It's part of the GDP, sorry. Yes. And creates employment.
It creates employment in that area. Whether or not it creates employment generally is a question of, is there slack unemployment? I agree, people work at factories, yes.
Right. And that's measured as part of the GDP.
Yes.
My point is, sir, is that activities that you have included as relevant expenses are part of the GDP. They do support employment. And yet you use that distinction to say it's one of the other purposes of things such as fire expenses. See what the distinction is?
I do not.
So there are other activities that we've looked at
Uh-huh.
at tab 19 that also are part of employment and GDP. And yet, when we go back to fire expenses, you use that as one of the reasons why there should be some sort of discounting or dismissal of fire expenses because it produces GDP.
Oh, sorry. Paying people to work might affect how we measure GDP. So the fact that you're paying a salary to someone, one of the other examples we used, I forget the exploration and estimation of timber birds. That's the first one I see here. As you said, we probably, or the Crown probably paid a person to go out and explore timber birds. That person would have consumed some of their income, invested some of their income, paid taxes for the government. That's how mechanically it would filter up to GDP. Okay. I don't disagree with that, but the Crown is paying that and also receiving a benefit of direct Crown resource revenues. Okay. So there's a connection between that expense and direct Crown resource revenues. That's very close. This may be a reason why you might want to say all of these should be allocated more broadly to GDP. But for fire in particular, right, the government has told us there are these many purposes for which it undertakes fire activity, and also what GDP we're talking about. In that little bottom box a few slides ago, I think it was dark blue, other economic benefits. There, I was restricting myself to the GDP of the forestry sector. You could say it supports the GDP of communities, the GDP as the country as a whole, but it is an expense that is providing benefits in the form of stumpage charges. And to your point, protecting these companies so they can pay income taxes and other things, and providing employment and other benefits generally. It's directed at a much broader set of purposes, whereas like the mining recorders are there to record the fees and so on coming from the mines, right? It's a very tight connection.
What I don't see here is any apportionment or breakdown about the fire protection services and these other benefits you claim. You didn't say public safety, I'll give it a 5% discount. Or infrastructure protection, I'll give it a 7% discount.
Sorry, so you're saying on the slide 164 that was in tab 18?
That's right. So you're saying there's a narrow benefit to the Crown in the gold box.
Oh, I'm saying there's lots of benefits to the Crown. In this Crown resource revenue activity, we're all only measuring that narrow benefit going to the orange. So yeah, I don't go through an attribution. I did in my slides using some examples from the 2000s, and I showed that the green relative to the orange box is, roughly 49-1. And so you'd allocate a lot more to the green box.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
what I don't see here is like what percentage is the orange box?
I don't understand.
You've excluded fire services entirely after 1917.
That's right.
That's right. And these other
Sorry,
benefits.
I've excluded net fire expenses. Okay. Because I also exclude like the fire marshal's tax and the revenues associated with them. I have a discussion in my report about this.
Right.
That's why, Ontario-wide, Professors Bodway and Smart have generally higher forestry revenues than I do because they include those revenues.
Well, hold on. I thought you said last week that the fire tax roughly makes up about 30%.
That's right.
That's right. Okay, so let's talk about 70%. You've excluded that.
That's right. I've effectively said that 30% went to the orange box that I didn't count the revenues of.
The orange box
Oh.
being direct Crown resource revenues.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. Yep.
So you apportion 30% of firefighting expenses to direct Crown resource revenues.
Effectively by not including other revenues that I considered more like fee for service, right? That the commercial companies are paying these taxes. And that's also why, as I spoke about earlier this morning, with respect to the rents analysis, when I'm taking a broader view, I include 30% of the fire expenses. So no, I didn't go through this exercise. I thought it was a bit of a, before 1917, I include all of the fire expenses. Okay. I know that's wrong, right? That's too much. Some of the fire expenses, that's effectively allocating it all to just stumpage revenues, right? That's too much. As your point, at least some of it has to go to protecting communities, protecting people, protecting these businesses. I didn't have a way to separate it. Once the Crown starts charging, somewhat like a fee for service, it then is revealed maybe how much the commercial operators are paying. And so I can ignore that part and then say the rest is related to general government function, which is what I do. But again, before 1917, unless you put zero value on communities, property, infrastructure, other economic benefits, and indirect revenues, I've included too much in expenses before 1917.
Well, that was my point. I didn't see what value did apply to them. That's what I mean.
Right, so before 1917, I do effectively the same thing as Professors Bodway and Smart. I include them all as charges against direct Crown resource revenues. As I explained last week, I know that's too much. Right? That has to be. There are other benefits, all the ones we just talked about. That you gave me a list of employment and public safety. I've effectively said it costs nothing to provide those. That has to be wrong, but I didn't have a way of apportioning it, so I erred on the side of being over-inclusive. Once there is a way of saying, well, how much are we going to recover from commercial operators? That portion I set aside. I don't count the revenues, I don't count the expenses. And implicitly everything else is then related to these other, the community, the property, the infrastructure, and the green and blue boxes. So I don't have to allocate it to those because, sorry, I also realize I'm speaking fast. I'll take a breath. If I was here to say, what is the net Crown community benefit, sticking with that first row of the middle example, then I would have to think about how much should I attribute to communities. But I wasn't here to do that, so I didn't have to do that exercise. I just have to say, how much do I need to attribute to the direct Crown resource revenues? And after the fee for service comes in, I say those offset, and the balance is for all those other purposes. Does that make sense?
I think you eventually got
Okay,
the answer that I was looking for. You didn't attribute the other items. You attributed the gold box, the orange box. That's what you just,
before
what you're saying.
1917.
yes,
Before 1917, I do the same thing.
right.
That's right. After 1917, I do something different. I'm just pointing out that, before 1917, I attribute too much. Kind of like the surveys we talked about last week. Some of those surveys were for highways, some of those surveys were for free grant lands. I didn't have a way of reliably disentangling them, so I included them, even though I know that's including too much. Okay,
Okay, I'm at my natural break point and it's 4 o'clock. This might be the good time to break for the day and then I can finish tomorrow.
All right. And what's your estimate for what you need?
I think an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours at the long end.
Okay,
That should do it.
thank you very much. So we'll break for the day and Jessica, we can go off.